What's up, guys? This is Dr. Kyle from Cape Chiropractic and Acupuncture coming at you with this week's movement tip of the week. Tis the season for running outside, although it may not seem like it in Maine so far. It's still pretty rainy and drizzly, but we're going to talk about running in general and some of the implications it can have on the low back. Many runners that we deal with in our clinic have a tendency to get really tight lumbar spine paraspinal muscles, or just some discomfort and tension, especially after running for prolonged periods of time. And there's a few reasons why this can happen, and a lot of these topics have been covered in previous movement tips, but this is going to be like a synthesis type of week where we kind of integrate a few of these concepts and put them together for a more dynamic motion such as running. So what a lot of runners tend to do is default into this what we call lumbar hyperextension pattern, which we've talked about before, and it can put a lot of stress on the joints in the lumbar spine known as the facet joints, right? And there is a multitude of reasons why this can happen. It can happen from deep anterior chain tension. You guys have all heard of hip flexors, so tight hip flexors, which is a movement tip we've addressed previously. It can also occur from lumbopelvic instability, or the inability to control your low back in certain positions just because of maybe a muscular imbalance or a core imbalance. Things like dead bugging, bird dogs are great for that. And then sometimes it's just a simple motor pattern or movement that we need to address. So when a lot of people are running, what you tend to see, especially as people fatigue, is instead of running and staying in a nice vertical or linear position here, when they get really tired, instead of trying to propel and extend off of their hip and use their glutes, they tend to get tired and open up their rib cage and extend through their low back. So if you're running along and you're running in this extended or open position over and over again, you're not allowing your body to be in optimal position to use the glutes, and you're creating a lot of shortening in the lumbar spine here. So one simple cue that you can use when you're running is try to envision yourself as staying slightly forward leaning as you're running, and try to maintain your rib cage or keep your rib cage going down just slightly. You don't want to be flexing your anterior cord dramatically when you're running, but just think of trying to stay closed a little bit more than you would as you're leaning forward. That's going to help keep your spine in an optimal position and allow you to use your gluteal musculature a little bit more. So that is one cue, just something that you can use from a motor control standpoint when you're actually running to help reduce the sensitivity. But a great way to attack this prior to your run is by doing some movement preparation, which I'm a huge proponent of, as are many other movement enthusiasts. Getting the right muscles primed before you go run is one of the more important things that you can do to reduce the likelihood of this happening. So, like I said, we've talked about stretching out the hip flexors before. That's a great place to start. We've talked about things like the dead bug, things to control the anterior core. And obviously things like gluteal bridging are all great places to start. But today we're going to kind of synthesize, like I said, and put a movement together that I think would be very helpful if you guys are squeezed or pressed for time, that will address the anterior core, so you're limiting your hyperextension this way, while also teaching you to use your glutes in the same fashion or in the same movement. So this plank variation, I'm sure you guys have all heard of a plank, but this one in particular I think is great because it addresses the anterior core, so it keeps this nice and tight so you're not going into extension, but also it teaches you or emphasizes the use of your gluteal muscles in the posterior chain in place of extending through your low back and hyperextending over and over again. So a few things when you're doing this plank: stay nice and tight through the anterior core, okay? And then what we're going to do is essentially simulate what a running gait would look like by using knee or hip flexion and hip extension, okay? So you get into this plank position here, okay? I'm squeezing my belly nice and tight here. I'm actually giving my glutes a little bit of a squeeze as well right now, okay? And what I want to do is, similar to something like the bird dog, is pretend that there's like a glass of water or whatever it may be on my pelvis, okay? And I want to minimize the amount of rocking that you see as I'm doing this movement, okay? So you go from nice and tight, slight squeeze in the glutes, slight squeeze in the anterior core, flex your leg up without tilting or hyperextending, and then bring your leg straight back. Now the important part here is when you bring your leg straight back, you should be feeling activation in your glutes mostly, and maybe a little in your hamstrings, okay? So hip up and then back. I like to use the cue of shoot a laser beam through your heel. That can really help emphasize
the gluteal facilitation, okay? And then switch sides and do the same thing. So one thing that people would tend to do, especially when they're running and they're extending their hips, is they go like this. We don't want to see that. So stay nice and tight, extend through the legs, shoot laser beams, and then come down. It's not easy.
Try a few of those before you go run and see how that resets the system. Let me know what you guys think.